Two men who once called each other brothers. One married the other's daughter. They conquered half the known world together, and then they tried to kill each other in a war so savage it turned Roman legions against Roman legions, father against son, brother against brother. This wasn't an invasion. There was no foreign enemy, no barbarian horde at the gates. This was Rome, tearing itself apart from the inside. Julius Caesar, the brilliant general who conquered Gaul and made Rome an empire. Pompey the Great, the legendary commander who'd never lost a battle, the man they called Rome's Alexander. When these two titans collided, the Roman Republic didn't just bleed, it died. And here's what they don't tell you in school. This wasn't about politics, it wasn't about ideology. It was about pride, betrayal, and two egos so massive they couldn't fit in the same world. One of them had just suffered a crushing defeat, his army shattered, his men demoralized, his supplies running out. The smart move? Retreat, rebuild, live to fight another day. But Caesar didn't retreat. He marched deeper into enemy territory with a broken army and gambled everything on one final battle. And what happened next didn't just decide who ruled Rome, it decided whether Rome would even survive. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 2,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these stories matter. Please subscribe to History Vault and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. Let's rewind 6 months before the battle that would change everything. The year is 48 BC. The place, Dyrrhachium, on the coast of what's now Albania. Caesar had Pompey trapped, surrounded. His entire strategy was to starve Pompey's massive army into submission without risking a major battle. It was working. Until it wasn't. Pompey's forces broke through Caesar's fortifications in a sudden, brutal assault. Caesar's legions, the same men who'd conquered Gaul, who'd crossed the Rhine, who'd invaded Britain, were routed. It was Caesar's first major defeat in over a decade. The casualties were devastating, hundreds of his veterans dead, his fortifications abandoned, his entire siege strategy in ruins. And now Caesar faced the kind of decision that breaks lesser men. He had 3 options, all of them terrible. Option 1, retreat to Italy by land. Sounds simple, right? Just march home, rebuild, raise fresh legions, and come back stronger. Except the route to Italy meant crossing hundreds of miles of hostile, barren terrain. His men were exhausted, supplies were critically low, and he'd have to abandon the legions he'd stationed across the eastern provinces to fend for themselves. If Pompey caught him on that march, Caesar's army would be slaughtered in the wilderness. Option 2, sail to Italy. Even simpler, get on boats and go home. There was just one problem. Caesar didn't have boats. Pompey's fleet controlled the entire Mediterranean. His warships patrolled every harbor, every coastline, every possible landing point. If Caesar tried to build or steal a fleet, Pompey would destroy it before it even left port. Option 3, the insane option. March deeper into Greece, away from safety, away from reinforcements, straight into hostile territory where most cities had just declared for Pompey after hearing about Caesar's defeat. It was military suicide. So, naturally, that's exactly what Caesar did. Because Caesar understood something about war that most generals miss. Sometimes the most dangerous move is the safest. Pompey would expect him to retreat, to sail home, to do the logical thing. So Caesar did the illogical thing. He marched his broken, exhausted, half-starved army into the fertile plains of Thessaly, straight toward the regions where he could resupply, regroup, and link up with his scattered forces under General Domitius. But here's what made this move genius. Caesar traveled light. He sent his baggage train, all the heavy supplies, equipment, and wounded soldiers, ahead on the fastest route. His legions marched with minimal gear, moving at twice the speed of Pompey's army, which was weighed down by its own success. Pompey had options too. His advisors were begging him to sail to Italy, to take Rome while Caesar was stuck in Greece, to secure the capital and declare total victory. But Pompey didn't want to defeat Caesar. He wanted to destroy him. Pompey's army was riding a wave of confidence after Dyrrhachium. His men believed they were invincible. His cavalry, 7,000 strong compared to Caesar's pathetic 1,000, had never been beaten. Pompey could taste complete victory, total annihilation of his rival. So he set off in pursuit. Now began one of the strangest chases in military history. Caesar was racing to reach the town of Apollonia to resupply and link up with Domitius. Pompey was racing to catch Caesar before he could recover. But both armies were also sending messengers in every direction, trying to contact allied forces, spread propaganda, secure supplies. And this is where things get chaotic. Pompey's couriers spread word of Caesar's defeat everywhere they went. Town after town that had been neutral or even friendly to Caesar suddenly slammed their gates shut. No food, no supplies, no entry. Caesar's messengers trying to reach Domitius kept getting captured or lost. Only one message got through: Caesar's order for Domitius to march immediately and meet him. But the message didn't say where, so Domitius made his best guess. He broke camp and marched at top speed down the Via Egnatia, the main Roman road, heading toward Dyrrhachium and Apollonia. Here's the problem. Pompey's entire army was marching down that exact same road, coming straight toward him. By pure chance, or maybe divine intervention, Domitius's scouts spotted Pompey's advance just 4 hours before the armies would have collided. 4 hours. If they'd been 4 hours slower, Domitius's force would have been destroyed before Caesar even knew they were in danger. Domitius immediately wheeled his army around and force-marched in the opposite direction. His men covered over 30 miles in a single day, an extraordinary feat for Roman legions in full gear. And finally, near the town of Aeginium, close to the Thessalian border, the two forces united. Now Caesar had his full army back, but he was still outnumbered, still low on supplies, still deep in hostile territory, and Pompey was right behind him. Quick question, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to know how far these Roman stories are traveling. Caesar's reunited army marched on the city of Pompey. This city had been loyal to Caesar, they'd pledged support, they'd opened their gates before. But news of Caesar's defeat at Dyrrhachium had changed everything. When Caesar's exhausted legions arrived at the walls, the gates stayed shut. The city elders sent a message: "We support Pompey now. Go away." Caesar had a choice. He could bypass the city, continue marching, and hope to find supplies elsewhere. Or he could make an example. Caesar chose violence. Within hours, Pompey fell. Caesar let his men sack the city completely. It was brutal, calculated, and necessary, not for supplies, but for psychological warfare. The message to every other city in the region was clear: choose your side carefully. The next city, Metropolis, opened its gates immediately. Meanwhile, after Domitius had marched to join Caesar, General Scipio, one of Pompey's commanders, pulled his forces back to the city of Larissa. That's where Pompey's army caught up. Now the two sides drew close to each other near the city of Pharsalus. Pompey positioned his camp on high ground at the foot of the mountains. Caesar made camp in the valley below. And then nothing happened for days. Every morning, Caesar would form up his legions and march them closer to Pompey's position. He'd deploy for battle, challenge Pompey to fight, and every morning, Pompey would form up his own troops on the hillside, giving himself the massive advantage of higher ground, and then just wait. He refused to attack. Caesar was running out of options. His supplies were critically low. Every day without a battle was another day his army got weaker. The Roman aristocrats in Pompey's camp, the senators, the nobles, the old guard, were screaming at Pompey to attack. They wanted Caesar's head. They wanted this war finished. But Pompey was too smart for that. He knew Caesar's men were starving. He knew time was on his side. Why risk a battle when hunger would do the work for him? So Caesar tried everything. He moved his camp closer. He marched his men up and down in front of Pompey's position. He issued challenges, insults, provocations. Nothing worked. Finally, Caesar realized he'd been outmaneuvered. He gave the order to break camp and march away, to find supplies elsewhere and try again. And that's when Pompey made his move. Because Pompey hadn't been waiting out of fear. He'd been waiting for the perfect moment. The moment when Caesar's army thought the battle was off, when they'd let their guard down, when they were tired, hungry, and psychologically defeated. Pompey marched his army down from the hills. He deployed on the slope, not at the top where Caesar could refuse battle, but low enough to force Caesar to fight. Caesar's men saw Pompey's banners, they heard the war horns, and they stopped packing. This was it, the battle they'd been begging for. Let's talk about the armies. Caesar claimed Pompey had 55,000 men. Modern historians think it was closer to 40,000. Caesar had about 30,000, but the real difference was in cavalry. Pompey had 7,000 horsemen, Caesar had 1,000. In ancient warfare, cavalry could decide everything. They were the flankers, the shock troops, the unit that could sweep around an enemy line and crush them from behind. A 7-to-1 advantage in cavalry was basically insurmountable. On paper, Caesar had already lost. But Caesar's legions had one thing Pompey's didn't: experience. Caesar's men had been fighting together for a decade. They'd conquered Gaul, crossed the Rhine, invaded Britain. They'd fought in forests, mountains, rivers, and open plains. They were veterans of 50-plus battles. Many of Pompey's troops? Fresh recruits, men who'd been farmers 6 months ago. And then there was morale. Pompey's men were confident, overconfident even. Caesar's men were angry. They'd been humiliated at Dyrrhachium. They'd been chased across Greece. They'd been starved and mocked. And they wanted blood. Pompey deployed in the standard Roman formation, heavy infantry in 3 lines, his right flank anchored on the Enipeus River, his left flank stretching out onto the open plain, and all 7,000 of his cavalry massed on the left under Commander Titus Labienus, Caesar's former friend and now his most bitter enemy. The plan was simple. Hold the center with infantry, let Caesar's men exhaust themselves attacking uphill, then unleash the cavalry in one massive charge to crush Caesar's right flank, swing into his rear, and destroy him. It was a textbook strategy. It should have worked. Caesar deployed in 3 lines too, but his lines were thinner, only 6 ranks deep compared to Pompey's 10. Why? Because Caesar had to match Pompey's width or risk being outflanked. On Caesar's left, the 8th and 9th legions, so depleted from earlier battles they barely functioned as one full-strength legion. On Caesar's right, the 10th legion, Caesar's most loyal, most experienced, most terrifying troops. These men had followed Caesar through hell. They'd bled with him, they'd won with him. If anyone could hold the line, it was the 10th. In the center, the 11th and 12th legions. Caesar himself stood opposite Pompey, commander versus commander, general versus general. And then Caesar did something unexpected. He looked at Pompey's cavalry, that massive 7,000-man death machine massing on his right flank, and he made a decision that would determine the entire battle. He pulled 3,000 men from his legions, elite soldiers from every cohort, and he hid them behind his right flank. He gave them one job. When Pompey's cavalry charges, you don't throw your javelins, you use them as spears, and you target the riders' faces. It was an insane order. Roman soldiers were trained to throw their pila, their javelins, and then draw swords for close combat. Using pila as melee spears went against every instinct, every training drill they'd ever done. But Caesar knew something about cavalry that most commanders forget. Horses don't charge into walls, and men with spears pointed at their faces don't want to ride forward. The stage was set. 2 Roman armies, the same training, the same tactics, the same weapons, but only one would walk away. The battle began with Caesar's first and second lines advancing together. Not charging, not running, marching. Shields up, formation tight, closing the distance. This was standard Roman doctrine. Both sides knew it. You march within range, pause, and then, at the last possible second, you sprint. The goal is to hit the enemy line with maximum force while they're still stationary, creating a physical shockwave that can shatter their formation. Caesar's men expected Pompey's troops to do the same, to wait, to absorb the charge, to crash together in one brutal moment. But Pompey had given his men different orders. Hold your ground, don't advance, let them come to you. It was a calculated risk. Pompey wanted Caesar's men to exhaust themselves running uphill, to arrive at his lines out of breath, formations loose, vulnerable. So Caesar's legionaries marched up that slope. They picked up speed, they transitioned into a full run, and Pompey's line just stood there. Caesar's veterans immediately recognized the problem. They were about to slam into a stationary, fresh, well-rested enemy line while they were sprinting uphill and gasping for air. So they did something extraordinary. They stopped, halfway up the slope, in the middle of a charge. They stopped, caught their breath, reformed their ranks, and then charged again. This wasn't panic, this wasn't confusion. This was discipline so perfect it looked like choreography. They covered the final distance, hurled their pila in perfect unison, drew their swords, and crashed into Pompey's line with brutal precision. The sound was deafening. Shield against shield, sword against sword. The front ranks of both armies locked together in a grinding, savage melee. Men pushed, stabbed, died. And for the first few minutes, the line held. Then, Caesar's veterans started to break through. Not everywhere, not dramatically, but inch by inch, Pompey's first rank started to crack. The second rank moved up to reinforce. The fighting intensified. And then, Pompey unleashed his trump card. All 7,000 cavalry, along with archers and light infantry, swept forward on the left flank. The goal, smash through Caesar's tiny 1,000-man cavalry force, wheel around, and destroy his entire right flank from behind. Caesar's horsemen rode out to meet them. The clash was brief. Caesar's cavalry fought hard, but they were simply overwhelmed. 7-to-1 odds don't lie. They broke, they retreated, and Pompey's cavalry surged forward, preparing to swing around Caesar's exposed flank. Victory was seconds away. And that's when Caesar gave the signal. Those 3,000 hidden legionaries, the ones Caesar had pulled from his main line and positioned behind his right flank, moved forward. They didn't throw their javelins, they charged with them. Pompey's cavalry saw infantry rushing toward them with long spears leveled at their faces, and they panicked. Because here's what you need to understand about cavalry. Horses are prey animals. They don't want to run into sharp objects. A horse will happily charge at a loose formation of men with swords, but a wall of spear points aimed directly at its face, it stops. And when your horse stops in the middle of a cavalry charge, you're not a warrior anymore. You're a target. Caesar's legionaries slammed into Pompey's cavalry like a hammer hitting glass. They stabbed upward into the riders' faces, chests, arms. They pulled men from their horses. They formed a wall that nothing could break. Pompey's cavalry, which had expected an easy flanking maneuver, suddenly found themselves in a brutal close-quarters melee they weren't trained for. The confidence shattered. First one rider turned, then 10, then 100, and then the entire cavalry wing routed. 7,000 horsemen fleeing the field in total panic. But Caesar's legionaries didn't chase them. They didn't celebrate. They didn't even pause. Following Caesar's orders to the letter, they wheeled as one unit and charged toward Pompey's archers and light infantry, who were now completely exposed without cavalry cover. Pompey's skirmishers, lightly armed, trained for harassment, not close combat, saw 3,000 Roman legionaries in full armor charging directly at them. They broke immediately. And again, Caesar's men didn't pursue. They wheeled again, and now they hit Pompey's main infantry line from the side. While the 10th Legion continued their frontal assault, Caesar's reserve smashed into Pompey's left flank and rear. Pompey's troops were now fighting on two sides. And that's when Caesar played his final card. He ordered his third line, the fresh troops who hadn't yet entered the battle, to advance. These men had been waiting, watching their comrades bleed, itching for their turn. Now they got it. They surged forward, relieving the exhausted frontline troops and hitting Pompey's already shaken legionaries with fresh energy, fresh rage, and perfect timing. Pompey's line buckled, then it bent, then it broke. First, one cohort fell back, then another, then entire centuries were turning and running. The retreat became a rout, and once a Roman formation breaks, it's almost impossible to restore. Pompey's men fled toward their camp, the fortified position on the hill where they'd been camped for days. Caesar's legionaries pursued, still in formation, still disciplined. They reached the camp's ramparts. Pompey's men tried desperately to hold the gates and fortifications. It didn't matter. Caesar's veterans stormed the camp in minutes. And that's when Pompey realized the battle was lost. He'd been watching from his command position as his cavalry routed, as his flank collapsed, as his entire army disintegrated. He didn't wait to be captured. Pompey removed his general's cloak, left his command tent, and walked calmly through the chaos toward the camp's rear gate. He escaped with only a handful of his closest companions. The man who'd been called Pompey the Great, Rome's greatest general, was now a fugitive running for his life. As night fell, Caesar's legionaries surrounded the hills where Pompey's fleeing soldiers had tried to regroup. They blocked every road, every path, every escape route. By morning, Pompey's army had ceased to exist. Ancient sources vary, but somewhere between 6,000 and 15,000 of Pompey's men were dead. Over 20,000 were captured. Caesar's losses? Around 4,000 killed. Heavy, but sustainable. The entire aristocratic faction that had opposed Caesar, senators, nobles, patricians, surrendered in droves. And Caesar, in a move that would define his political genius, pardoned almost all of them, including one young aristocrat named Marcus Junius Brutus. Remember that name. Real quick, do you think pardoning Brutus was Caesar's biggest mistake? Drop yes or no in the comments. Let's see if you know where this is heading.
Pompey ran, not like a coward, like a survivor. He reached the coastal city of Larissa, where his closest advisors caught up with him. They had options, bad options, but options. Option 1, sailed to Utica in North Africa. Most of his remaining supporters had gathered there. Cato the Younger was there, one of the last true believers in the Republic. They could regroup, rebuild, launch a guerrilla war that could last years. Option 2, flee to Parthia, the Eastern Empire that had humiliated Rome at Carrhae. Pompey could offer himself as an ally, give the Parthians Roman military expertise in exchange for an army to retake Rome. It was desperate, humiliating, but possible. Pompey chose neither. He chose Egypt. Because years earlier, Pompey had done the Egyptian king a favor. He'd helped restore King Ptolemy XIII to his throne after a rebellion. He'd forged an alliance. Pompey believed Egypt owed him. He believed he'd be welcomed as a hero, given sanctuary, given time to recover. He was wrong. Pompey boarded a merchant ship and sailed through the Mediterranean, stopping briefly at Amphipolis, Mytilene, and Cyprus, always one step ahead of Caesar's pursuit. Caesar, meanwhile, had sent word to every province, every ally, every corner of the Roman world. Pompey must not be allowed to regroup. He wasn't taking chances. He wasn't giving Pompey time to start another war. This had to end. Pompey's ship finally arrived off the coast of Alexandria, Egypt. He sent a message to the young king, Ptolemy XIII, now just 13 years old, asking permission to land. The Egyptian court received the message and held an emergency council. Here's the problem they faced. If they welcomed Pompey, Caesar would be furious. He might invade Egypt, destroy Alexandria, install a different ruler. But if they turned Pompey away, and he somehow won the war, he'd remember the insult. He'd come back with legions and burn Egypt to the ground. Either choice was dangerous. So they chose a third option. They would remove the problem. The court, led by 3 advisors, Pothinus the eunuch, Theodotus the rhetoric teacher, and Achillas the commander of the Egyptian guard, decided Pompey had to die. Not as an execution, as a gift to Caesar. They sent word back to Pompey, "Of course you're welcome. Come ashore. We'll receive you with honors." They sent a small boat to bring him from his ship to the beach. On that boat were two men, Achillas, the guard commander, and Lucius Septimius, a Roman military tribune who'd once served under Pompey in his eastern campaigns. Pompey recognized Septimius immediately, an old comrade, a familiar face. He relaxed. His wife Cornelia and his son watched from the ship as Pompey climbed down into the boat. As they rowed toward shore, Pompey tried to make small talk with Septimius. Septimius didn't respond. Pompey sensed something was wrong. He stood up, ready to jump overboard and swim back to the ship, and that's when Septimius drew his sword. Pompey turned. Their eyes met. Septimius, the soldier who'd fought for Pompey, who'd been promoted by Pompey, who owed everything to Pompey, stabbed him in the back. Then Achillas joined in. They butchered him in that tiny boat while his family watched from the ship, screaming. Pompey the Great, the man who'd conquered the East, who'd cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, who'd been Rome's greatest general, was murdered by a former subordinate in a rowboat off the coast of Egypt. He was 58 years old. The Egyptians cut off his head. They left his body on the beach to rot. They preserved the head as a gift for Caesar.
When Caesar finally arrived in Egypt days later, pursuing Pompey to finish the civil war, the Egyptians proudly presented him with Pompey's severed head. Caesar wept. Maybe he was genuinely grief-stricken. Pompey had been his friend, his ally, his daughter's husband. Or maybe it was political theater. Or maybe it was relief that the war was finally truly over. We'll never know. But Caesar gave orders for Pompey's remains to be cremated with full honors. He had the ashes sent to Cornelia so she could bury them properly. And then Caesar turned his attention to the Egyptian court, because killing a Roman consul without trial, that was an insult to Rome itself. But that's a story for another time. Back in Rome, the civil war was still simmering. Pompey's commanders were still fighting in pockets across the empire. In Sicily, Admiral Cassius had arrived with a fleet and launched raids on Caesar's ships. He struck the harbor at Messana first, catching Caesar's fleet completely by surprise. Using fire ships, he destroyed the entire squadron before anyone could respond. Then he sailed to Vibo and did it again, though this time Caesar's forces were ready and drove him off. In Italy, another Pompeian commander named Libo had been blockading the port of Brundisium for months, keeping Caesar's reinforcements trapped. He'd seized an island in the harbor and used it as a base to harass Caesar's fleet with impunity. No amount of minor defeats or supply shortages could dislodge him. Only when news of Pompey's death at Pharsalus reached him did Libo finally abandon the blockade. The message was clear. The war was over. Pompey was dead. The Republic, the Roman Republic that had stood for nearly 500 years, was finished. All that remained was Caesar. But even Caesar couldn't hold it together, because one of the men he'd pardoned after Pharsalus, one of the aristocrats he'd forgiven, one of the senators he'd shown mercy to, was already planning his revenge. Marcus Junius Brutus, the man Caesar treated like a son, the man who would, 4 years later, drive a knife into Caesar's chest on the floor of the Senate. But Brutus didn't act out of evil or ambition. He acted because he believed, genuinely, passionately believed, that Caesar had destroyed the Republic, that Caesar had become a tyrant, that the only way to save Rome was to kill Caesar. Was he right? Historians still argue about it 2,000 years later. What we know for certain is this. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, Rome plunged into another civil war, and another, and another. The Republic never recovered. It took Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, later called Augustus, to finally end the cycle of violence by becoming Rome's first emperor. The Republic died at Pharsalus. It just took a few more years for everyone to realize it. If this story gave you chills, tap subscribe. This is the kind of history that deserves to be remembered, not the sanitized textbook version. So what do we do with a story like this? Caesar won. Pompey lost. Rome got an emperor instead of a republic. Simple, right? Except it's not simple at all, because here's what they don't teach you in school. The Battle of Pharsalus wasn't about good versus evil. It wasn't about democracy versus tyranny. It wasn't even about two different visions for Rome's future. It was about two men whose egos couldn't fit in the same world, and Rome paid the price. Let's talk about what Pharsalus actually meant. Before Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, the Roman Republic had survived for nearly 500 years. 500 years! It had survived invasions by Hannibal, slave rebellions led by Spartacus, political corruption that would make modern governments blush. But it survived because of one principle. No one man could hold absolute power. That was the whole point of the Republic. Power was divided. Consuls served one-year terms. The Senate checked the military checked the Senate. It was messy, it was inefficient, it was corrupt, but it worked. Until it didn't. Because Caesar and Pompey broke the system. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but they became so powerful, so popular, so necessary to Rome's survival that the Republic couldn't function without them. And then it couldn't function with them. Pompey had been Rome's golden boy. He'd cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in 3 months, a feat that had seemed impossible. He'd conquered the eastern provinces and brought unimaginable wealth flowing into Rome. He was called Pompey the Great while he was still alive. That's how legendary he was. But Pompey had one flaw. He needed validation. He needed recognition. He needed everyone to acknowledge that he was Rome's greatest general. And then Caesar showed up. Caesar, who'd been dismissed as a playboy politician, who'd been underestimated his entire career, who'd been given Gaul as a consolation prize, a backwater province no one cared about. Caesar turned Gaul into an empire. He conquered territories Pompey had never even dreamed of. He crossed the Rhine twice. He invaded Britain twice. He wrote books about his conquests that became instant bestsellers. And suddenly, Rome had two greatest generals. Pompey couldn't handle it. The Senate couldn't handle it. And Rome, caught between two titans, tore itself apart. Here's the tragedy. If Caesar and Pompey had stayed allies, they could have ruled Rome together. They could have reformed the Republic, fixed its corruption, and ushered in a golden age. Instead, they destroyed it, not because they were evil, but because they were human. And humans are proud, jealous, and competitive, especially great men. After Pharsalus, Caesar tried to put Rome back together. He pardoned his enemies. He reformed the calendar. He planned infrastructure projects, legal reforms, and land redistribution. He tried to heal the wounds of the Civil War. But too many people remembered the Republic. They looked at Caesar and saw a king, and Romans hated kings, so they killed him. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, less than 4 years after Pharsalus, 23 senators surrounded Caesar in the theater of Pompey, the irony was not lost on anyone, and stabbed him to death. Brutus was among them. Caesar's last words, according to legend, were directed at Brutus. Kai su, teknon? You too, child? He didn't say it in anger. He said it in heartbreak. Because Caesar had loved Brutus like a son. He'd protected him, promoted him, forgiven him after Pharsalus. And Brutus repaid him with a knife.
But here's the twist. Brutus genuinely believed he was saving the Republic. He thought that if he killed Caesar, the Senate would reassert itself, the old system would return, Rome would be free again. He was wrong. Caesar's assassination didn't save the Republic. It triggered another civil war. Caesar's supporters, led by Mark Antony and Octavian, hunted down the conspirators. Brutus and Cassius fled east, raised armies, and fought the Caesarians at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. They lost. Brutus committed suicide, and then Antony and Octavian, who'd been allies, turned on each other. Another civil war. Finally, in 31 BC, at the Battle of Actium, Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra. The wars finally ended. Octavian became Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The Republic was dead. It had died at Pharsalus. It just took 17 more years and 2 more civil wars for the body to stop twitching.
So what's the lesson? Is it that great men are dangerous? That republics are fragile? That pride destroys everything? Maybe all of those things. But here's what I think. Pharsalus teaches us that systems are only as strong as the people who operate them. The Roman Republic worked for 500 years because Romans believed in it. They believed in shared power. They believed no one man should rule. But then Rome got so big, so complex, so wealthy that it needed strong leaders. And once you need strong leaders, you're one step away from needing a dictator. And once you have a dictator, the Republic is already gone. You just haven't admitted it yet. America's founding fathers knew this story. They studied Rome obsessively. They read about Pharsalus. They understood what happened when one man became too powerful. That's why they built checks and balances into the Constitution. That's why they limited presidential terms. That's why they divided power among 3 branches. They were terrified of creating another Caesar. But here's the question we should all be asking. Did they succeed? Because every generation thinks their republic is invincible. The Romans thought that too, right up until the moment it died. Pharsalus wasn't just a battle. It was the moment Rome stopped being a republic and started being an empire. And empires, no matter how powerful, always fall. The only question is when. Caesar and Pompey thought they were fighting for Rome's future. They were actually fighting over its corpse. One of them just didn't know it yet. And maybe, just maybe, if we remember this story, if we teach it, if we actually learn from it, we won't repeat it. But I wouldn't bet on that, because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that humans never learn from history. We just keep making the same mistakes with better technology. If this story made you think, here's what I need you to do. 1. Subscribe to History Vault, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about what it means, and we're going to keep digging into the stories that changed the world. 2. Share this video. Not because I want views, though that helps, but because this is the kind of history people need to hear, the real version, the human version. And 3. Leave a comment. Tell me, do you think the Roman Republic could have survived, or was Pharsalus inevitable? Because if we can answer that question, maybe, just maybe, we can save our own republics before they die. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and right now it's rhyming pretty damn loud. See you in the next one.